Hello, everyone. My name is Alex Colvin, and I'm the Public Programs Curator here at the Alabama Department of Archives and History. And I'm so happy to welcome you to this Alabama Women's History series as we take a textile tour of Justice Not Favor. Before we begin, I have a few quick announcements about upcoming programs. Please join us this Thursday, May 19th at noon for our next Food for Thought. Paul Pruitt will discuss Julia Tutwiler, and this program will be held in person here at the archives, as well as streamed live to our Facebook and YouTube channel. I'd also like to invite you next Monday, May 23rd at 6 p.m. to History Now, Reckoning with Shared Pasts. In this program, we'll have a discussion between Anne Banks, who is a descendant of Albert Pickett, and Karen Gutierrez, a descendant of Milton, who was enslaved by Pickett. These two women met during their genealogical research, and they will discuss how that process and how they tackled their family's difficult shared past. This discussion will be moderated by WSFA's Valerie Lawson, and this is an in-person event at 6 p.m. next Monday, May 23rd. Lastly, next Thursday, May 26th, is our final Alabama Women's History series, as Susan Ashmore will present on Lurleen B. Wallace, and that will come to you through our Facebook and YouTube channels. Without further ado, I'm very excited to introduce you to Dr. Diane Barnard, a collections curator here at the archives, as she takes us on a textile tour of our current temporary exhibit, Justice Not Favor, Alabama Women and the Vote, which is open through May 31st of this year.
Good afternoon. I'm going to take you on a tour of the textile part of the exhibit we have now running called Justice Not Favor. I always want to start by asking you to think about textiles, fabric, the clothing that you have on, because it's often asked, how can you tell history through textiles? But I'm here to hopefully show you that we collect textiles of all kinds, including quilts and flags, because there is a world of things that you can learn by looking at something like a dress or a flag. You can get sociology, cultural standards, economics, transportation, international affairs, all of this through textiles. So just keep that in mind as you listen. And, if you have questions later on, then I'll try to answer them for you. The first dress that we have is really not a dress. It's a skirt and what was called then a shirt waist. This dress was owned and worn by Bossy O'Brien Hundley. She was really a national figure in the fight for women's suffrage. She was born in 1876, and the first real convention on that subject was in 1848. So when she met her husband in 1896, she already had very strong opinions on women's right to vote. In fact, her husband was very impressed that she had such strong opinions. So this dress was bought by her in Paris on their honeymoon. They got married in 1897. This is obviously not an off the rack, as we would say today. It was commissioned. We don't know who the designer was, who the seamstress was, but in her journal that her family still has, she says that this dress was purchased or commissioned and purchased in Paris. Now, there are very deliberate choices in this dress. Green and this creamy white, and there's a little touch of gold and a little bit of blue at the bodice are colors that were used throughout the women's suffrage movement. The number of organizations in the U.S. used different colors, but as the movement grew and matured, it was really green, white, gold, and a sort of a blue tending toward purple is what you mostly saw. And then they went on to use white because it was very effective in parades and rallies. In this photograph, you will see a bluebird, and the very top of her shirt or bodice has a blue stripe, and you can see that the colors in the bluebird and that stripe match. You'll see that there are flecks of gold in the wheat kernels that are coming out on the sides. There were gold little faux rhinestones or something like that along that blue stripe. The gold stands for the purpose, the rightness of their cause. The white or cream now stands for the purity, also the rightness of their movement, and that they were going to stand fast to their cause. The blue and the purple are to signify loyalty. So all these colors are intertwined. And obviously, when you see this, you would describe this as a green dress. That is a symbol used by many of the suffragist organizations to indicate we have hope. So you put purity, loyalty, and hope all together, and that was that's what drove them to keep going, and because they had, as everyone knows, such difficulty in getting the 19th Amendment passed. Now, in this picture, you can see these very, very large sleeves. This was at the early 1890s, and it was supposed to be comfortable. The skirt, as you can see, is relatively comfortable. There's no bustle in the back. It's smooth, but you have these very large sleeves. But by the time 1897 comes along, all of that puff is beginning to slim out. In the United States, she would have been a little bit ahead of fashion because, remember, this was commissioned and purchased in Paris, and all fashion originated from Paris. And so by the time it filtered over to the United States, we were already just a little bit behind what would be happening in Europe. But her name that name Bossy was given to her by her nurse or nanny when she was very little. And I suspect that there was a good reason for that. And so she wouldn't have given a flip if she was not totally in fashion with these large sleeves. So she was making a statement. This was also the era of what costume historians tend to call the era of the complicated bodice. There are snaps and pins, and something has to go one way or else the rest of it won't fit over it. Very complicated. But Bossy came from a family that was very wealthy. She married into wealth, and so she had someone to help her get dressed and help her get out of these complicated things. There is no bustle. There's no room for a bustle in the back. So this is also when women's sports, what they called sports, riding a bicycle, playing field sports, playing light tennis, were becoming popular. You could not do that with a bustle. You might have a little padding at the back right below the lowest point of your back, but nothing like a bustle in the earlier periods. Now, if we look at the bottom of this dress, you will see that gold and blue. There's a little bit of green in the flowers, echoing what is going on at the top. We've been so fortunate that the family kept this dress and gifted it to the archives. Now we're going to move on to a later era. This is a very good example of what we would call a transitional piece, moving from the late 60s into 1972, the early 70s. This was worn by Elizabeth B. Andrews, and she's from Geneva, Alabama. She was educated at University of Montevallo, graduated from there in 1932 as a home economic teacher. It's important to know that as I go along with the story. She had an eye for design and for fashion. Her husband held 14 terms as a representative in the U.S. Congress from 1944 to 1971 when he died. So she was quite familiar with dressing for political events, dressing for dinners. I mean, she knew how to dress within that framework. And so when he died, she reluctantly took over his position from 72 to 1973, and she did not run again. When she took up the rest of her husband's term, she was already in her 60s. And her fashion taste, as with most people, men included, it's already basically sort of formed. Know what they like, know what they're comfortable in and what they're not comfortable in. And so you will see equal balance of 1960 elements and 1970 elements in this suit. It is double-breasted, which you really see a lot of that in the early 70s. But you still see that it's boxy. It does not have a real fitting silhouette. That is very definitely 1960. And so she has been comfortable in 1950 and 1960 more loose-fitting clothing. This green silk was very popular for high-end garments. This was custom made for her. And this lime green was a really considered a very sophisticated color for the 1960s and early 70s. Now we don't see a lot of lime green, but colors have cycles in fashions like any other thing does. Now the scarf, that is a hallmark of the 70s, either a piece of jewelry, right, a choker at the neck, a big collar, or a scarf. There's always something going on around at the neck. The jacket and the skirt are lined in this same silk that the ensemble is lined in. The skirt here is a little fuller than what you might have seen in the 60s, but it still has that basic straight silhouette. Another woman that is well known in Alabama and somewhat in the United States is Lurleen Wallace. This was her black suit that she wore for her inauguration in 1967 as the first female governor of Alabama. The interesting thing with Miss Wallace is that she had a series of suits. This particular one was made for her by George Williams Company that was down on Dexter Avenue, and the labels inside of it indicate George Williams Tailoring. She had other people around Montgomery who would design things for her. She had quite a bit of input, but they did the fine tuning after she told them what she was looking for. This suit is black wool, and you will see a little cravat. Now, it was cold, obviously, in January, or cool for Alabama, but if she did not have that in there, and she had just the top of a blouse or something, she just wouldn't look as powerful as this suit looks. Remember, she was the first female governor of Alabama, and she had fought her way through a political battle about her husband actually being the one who was inaugurated. So she had to look strong and like she could take whatever was thrown at her, because she was a very petite woman. So she had a matching black pillbox hat, and she had gloves and black shoes. And so when she stepped up to take the oath, as you could see in this picture, she looked the part. I have several pictures here that show her white jacket with a patch with the seal of Alabama on it. She had the white one, and she had a blue one. And those were made by another tailor in this area who is still here. But you would see her in dresses, but if she had any serious business to do, you would see her in a suit. We move on to the inaugural outfit that Kay Ivey, our present governor, wore to her inauguration in 2017. Now, she's a very practical woman and really kind of no nonsense. This is made by Eli Tahari, and he was a Israeli immigrant, and by 1990s he was setting the business world and women's clothing on fire. This is a high-end, right off the rack, Eli Tahari, and it just fits her personality. She has a cream turtleneck. Again, it's cold. They're outside for the inauguration. This beautiful red wool jacket and wool pants. And in this picture, you can see a 1936 coat that just rocked me when I ran across it online, because you can see how much it looks like her jacket. There's a few details that are in the 1936 picture, but you take this one set of seams on the side out and you have this jacket. I think that's cool. Red is her color. You can see, if you look online and you look at lots of pictures of her, you will see her in red jacket after red jacket. And you can see in this picture that her inaugural ball gown is red, also made by a local designer and tailor. This is Kay Ivey when she was campaigning with Lurleen Wallace for Ms. Wallace's gubernatorial campaign. And it's very interesting. She has some of this transitional clothing on that has that wide box feel and that narrow skirt. And here is Ms. Wallace in sort of an early, as far as style goes, double-breasted white jacket. Again, the jacket means I'm in business. We're going to be moving to another area of the exhibit, which depicts another group of women who are involved in and were involved in many years of women's rights. Unlike the garments of the 4 other women that you saw, these women did not wear custom-made garments. They did not wear high-end retail. These are pictures. We're going to use textiles and accessories to show you a whole nother story that we can get from what we put on our body. You're looking at the shoe that Betty Anderson wore on the 3rd march from Selma to Montgomery in March of 1965. There are 3 marches. First one was what we now term Bloody Sunday, where they did cross the bridge, but that as far as they got before they met the National Guard and violence broke out. The second march, they got about halfway across. They stopped to pray, and then they turned around and went back. The third march, they successfully crossed the bridge and continued on to Montgomery, where they were met with about 20,000 people here at the Capitol building. Betty and her brother did, we know for a fact, participate in that third march. This shoe, as you can see, has holes in the bottom of it. And when she was walking, it was approximately somewhere in Lowndes County, where a woman saw her limping, ran out with a Cracker Jack box, gave it to her to put inside of her shoe so that she could finish the march. And when they got back, their father, Joe Anderson, saved the clothing from, or their blue jeans from her brother and from Betty. And he made an apron out of it, and he wore that in his shoe shop for years. And we're so fortunate to have these here. This really is my favorite set of artifacts in this whole exhibit. Betty still lives in Camden and has a shoe museum where her father's shop was. We move over to a textile artifact that is pretty commonplace. It's a tote bag, which we all have a couple of those, and every time we go to an event, we get a tote bag. This one is pretty special, though. It's a Vera Bradley, and I'm sure all the women listening know who Vera Bradley is and what a Vera Bradley tote means. This was given to Adeline Clark, who is now Representative Adeline Clark, in 2012 as a Christmas present. And she had won her race, so she was going to go into office in 2013. And her family realized she needed a bag to carry papers and things like this around. Well, she became interested and really led the bill to pass the Equal Pay Act in Alabama in 2019. I spoke to her recently because I didn't know very much about this bag. And as she told me the story of how she would go to representatives and various people that could give her support for this very important bill, she needed something to put all those papers and all those notes in. And so she started putting them in this particular bag, and it became her file cabinet. Wherever she would go and would talk about this bill or take notes or get some papers from somebody, they went in this particular bag. And so she would just, take her walking file cabinet and go wherever she needed to go. And if somebody had questions, there it was in the bag. Or if somebody contradicted themselves, there it was in the bag. So she was most gracious to let us use this for this exhibit. And just a side fact, that black bag is the top seller for Vera Bradley. It is not the printed bags that we mostly think of. It's this black bag. And again, as I spoke about with Ms. Wallace, this is sort of a power symbol. Vera Bradley talks about in her ad for this black bag that it can accommodate anything from, a weekend trip, or you can take it to meetings and put all your papers in it and all your necessities for your office, and then you can carry it with you. So she talks about it being a bag as sort of a symbol of efficiency, organization, and power. Thank you for joining me this afternoon as we talked about the textile artifacts in this exhibition, and we hope that you will come and see the exhibition for yourself. I also hope that you thought about my opening statement about the importance of textiles as a vehicle to talk about history and to hit those points that may not be so obvious when you look at a piece of fabric. Please come and join us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to Diane for that amazing tour of Justice Not Favor and focusing in on the textiles that are on view right now in our temporary exhibit. And I hope that you have a chance to come out and see them in person, as well as the larger exhibit and the context around them. And again, that exhibit will be open until May 31st of this year. We were going to, at this moment, bring Diane on to be able to have a live Q&A, but unfortunately, Diane will not be able to join us today. But never fear, we do have an amazing curator with us, Ryan Blocker, who is our museum collections coordinator and an expert in textiles as well, is going to be joining us, and she'll be able to answer some questions if you have any. And we can also, if you have any questions about the exhibit at large, you can also feel free to ask that. And once you put it in the comments, we'll be able to see them and share them with Ryan. So welcome to Ryan.
Hello, everyone.
Perfect. Well, Ryan, thank you for joining us and being able to answer some questions about textiles here in our collection, and also the ones that are on view in Justice Not Favor. To begin with, Diane told us her favorite textile on view right now, and I would like to know what's your favorite textile that's currently in Justice Not Favor?
Oh, it definitely has to be the Bossy O'Brien Hunley dress. Could we bring up a picture of it, and I'll explain why? I like it so much. This is not a practical dress for Alabama heat and humidity, but Bossy was making a statement with this. This is her political statement, if you will. Her husband was a politician, so they're visiting politicians and having dinner with them. And so she could make a statement without having to say anything at all, because this is the colors of the suffrage movement. And the patterned silk of this velvet that you see here would have caught the light, especially at dinner at night. So she would have been sort of this sparkling center of attention. And if someone commented on her clothing, she could say, and this is total speculation on my part, then she could say, oh yes, these reflect the colors of the suffrage movement, and then talk about it from there. So it was a conversation starter and a way for her, again, to make a statement without having to say a word at all.
Definitely. No, and if people haven't come in person to see this dress up close, I mean, Diane touched on all the details, but there's so many details as you walk around it. But even just seeing it, you can just almost feel it, like even just looking at it, like how soft it must feel and how luxurious it is. And it definitely is a showstopper of a dress.
And it is silk velvet, and it's silk satin. And so this silk is very hot, especially in the summer. So you know that she probably didn't wear this quite often. She brought it out for special occasions, but it is a absolutely fabulous skirt and bodice, and really just has a lot of details that would have been very fashion forward for the period.
Definitely. Well, this great another great point. So I know this dress and Elizabeth Andrews' suit, as well as Lurleen Wallace's suit, they're all a part of our collection here at the archives. Can you tell us more about how they came to be a part of our collection?
Sure. Elizabeth Andrews actually donated the suit herself in 1992. Lurleen Wallace's suit actually was part of the Wallace Museum Foundation and actually came to us through the family through that. And we get fantastic stories from the family that are connected to it as well. But the Bossie's dress actually came to us by way of her granddaughter and great-granddaughter. Her granddaughter's name is Melinda Brown, and her great-granddaughter is Mitchell Brown, who's actually a professor at Auburn University, and I think in political science. So this is kind of fantastic that her great-granddaughter becomes someone who teaches other women about political history and the way that politics work, when her great-grandmother fought so hard to make sure that women had the right to vote. So I love that story. And that's, when things come in, we try to gather as much information about them from the family as possible. And so we were very grateful that we were able to get some of these stories from each one of these from the individuals that donated them.
And so keeping that kind of family history alive, but also it's so great to hear from the families the stories of the women who wore them. And of course, not all of our collections are just women's textiles. We have so many different textiles in our collection. Can you tell us about that collection and how we take care of it and what conservation work we do with textiles here at the archives?
Sure. We have a pretty extensive textile collection numbering over 2,000 pieces, but we have everything from quilts that came to Alabama that were made before Alabama became a state, and they were brought in with people who were coming into the state of Alabama. We have everyday clothes that people have worn. In fact, we just got one of my bucket list items a couple of years ago, which is a 3-piece polyester leisure suit. It really talks about fashion in that period. Now I'm on the hunt for bell bottoms. So if anybody has any bell bottoms in their home, bring them to the archives. But we have an extensive collection, everything from military uniforms, which talk about Alabama's involvement in every part of military experience. But we keep them in a controlled environment, because the things that are detrimental to textiles are the same thing that's detrimental to other artifacts: light, heat, humidity, and pest. And so we keep them between 65 and 72 degrees. We keep our humidity at 50%, and we don't overexpose them to bright environments at times, but they're all kept in acid-free boxes with acid-free tissue. They're only brought out for displays, and we try to make sure that they are kept in that stable environment anytime that they are not on display.
So what advice would you give people if they find a historic textile in their attic, a family heirloom? What advice would you give them to how to kind of maintain it, to keep it? What would be your first advice for them if they found some textile and to make sure it stays safe?
Well, attics can get pretty humid and hot, especially in the South. So if it's not environmentally controlled, I would take it out of the attic and put it somewhere that's a little more controlled. You want to make sure textiles will last the longest and stay in a better condition the flatter that they are. So the fewer creases that you put in or folds, the better off they are. Or if you have, for instance, a quilt, you found your great grandmother's quilt in the attic. It's been folded up for 30 years. You want to take that out, unfold it, and you're going to fold it so that you pad the folds with something like acid-free tissue, so that instead of creases where you get a sharp edge, you get a gentle curve, and that will help them stay a little bit longer. It keeps the fiber more not versatile, but more flexible, and not so brittle. You want to make sure that their environment, of course, is you're keeping it. A good rule of thumb is that if you are comfortable, your textiles are comfortable. So if it is hot and humid for you, your textiles feel hot and humid as well. So a stable environment. If you want to display them for periods of time, just bring them out for a little bit. For instance, a quilt on a bed, let it be on the bed on display for a little while, but you don't want it to have too much light, because with UV, it can fade and dry out threads or fiber. So I hope that answers.
Oh no, that is incredibly helpful, because it's things I wouldn't have even thought about, how to fold textile to make sure it stays, not creased. And we actually have a follow-up question here from Ethel Ann Kern-Keeple. Is acid-free tissue available in stores? Is that something people can just go buy?
You can buy it on Amazon, and there are two different types of acid-free tissue. There's a buffered and unbuffered tissue. The buffered has a buffering agent, but that can be harmful for animal-based textiles. So you want to use unbuffered acid-free tissue. You could buy it in places like Amazon. You can buy it from places like University Products, which supplies a lot of museums their material. Gaylord is also a museum supply company which has it. And both Gaylord and University Products also offer kits. So if you have like a wedding dress, they can give you an acid-free box and acid-free tissue to help you pad all of those folds, or you make sure that you have no sharp creases in your material.
Perfect. So there are these resources so people can make sure to preserve the textiles in their own home, so that it can be passed down from generation to generation. Excellent. So is there a particular process that you have to take to prepare textiles to go on exhibit? So Bossy's dress, is there anything you had to do or check before you were putting it into this exhibit?
Absolutely. From a general standpoint, not talking specifically about Bossy, but we have to make sure that the textiles are in exhibitable condition. In other words, they don't have any rips or tears in them that could be stretched when they're put on a mannequin. We have to make sure that where we're going to exhibit them is not going to get too much exposure to light, because we don't want them to get damaged while they're on display. And for instance, with Bossy's dress, the waist of that is so tiny that our smallest mannequin was too big for the dress. So we actually had to carve down our mannequin and the waist of it particularly to make sure that it fit and didn't strain the fiber too much. But that's something that we get to play around with a lot, and experiences making these mannequins sometimes. And we want to make them to sure, again, that we're not causing any stress to the fiber or the fabric of the textile.
So it's constantly trying to make sure everything you're doing is maintaining the integrity of the textile.
And then we continue to monitor it so that we make sure that we don't see any signs of strain or stress. For instance, like if we put a 1920s beaded dress on display, we would probably lay it flat versus putting it on a mannequin, because the 1920s are very popular for these very thin, flowy fabrics, but then they do the worst thing in the world, but also the best. They put hundreds of beads on them that weigh down the fabric so much. So if we were to put it on a mannequin, you would get stress and strain, especially in the seams. So you could pop seams or pop the threads in the fiber itself. So we don't want to do that. So we really look at what the exhibit is about, how best to display it so that it can continue to be viewed for years to come.
Exactly. Wow, I never even thought about that with the weight. You just look at a 1920s dress and you think how beautiful all those beadwork and everything, yeah. But the fact that it would weigh down a mannequin and put stress on the dress.
Yeah, and another thing, like 1930s dresses are very difficult because in the 1930s, they like to cut dresses on the bias. So the bias is a 45-degree angle, but it becomes more elastic or stretches more on the 45 degrees. Now, this also meant that in the 1930s, and it could be kind of scandalous, that, you know, it fit closer to the body. And it was absolutely beautiful when you see those old Hollywood movie stars wearing these bias cut dresses. But if you hang a bias cut dress, it's going to continue to stretch over time. And we've had dresses that were donated that look like the woman who wore them was 7 feet tall, but they were meant, you know, to be a lot more shorter, but they had been hung up in a closet very lovingly over the years, but not knowing how the textile was made, it stretched over time.
So would you also suggest if someone found something like a dress to when possible, to be able to fold it so that it wouldn't put stress on like an outfit?
Again, you know, there are certain things like the 1930s bias cut dresses, you don't want to hang those because they'll stretch over time. You also don't want to hang beaded clothing because it becomes a stress point at the shoulders and throughout the fabric. So those being laid down. Letterman's jackets, you can hang those, but you want to use padded hangers. And we have some resources here. I have a sort of a supply list and how-tos that we keep here that I can also make available, Alex.
Oh, perfect. That would be excellent for people to be able to reference. We have another question here from Scotty E. Kirkland. Ryan, what else is on that textiles bucket list?
Swimsuits, if you would believe it.
Really?
Because I would love to have an early bikini. Those were quite controversial when they first came out, especially places like the Montgomery Country Club. If you wanted to swim in their pool, they had to approve of your bathing suit, especially the bikinis, before you could wear them. So I'd love to have an early bikini. Let's see, we just got a gunny sack dress, which were really popular from the 70s to the 90s. Susan DeVos, actually, someone who worked with us previously, donated her 1970s prom gunny sack dress, which was that was one of my bucket list items. Let's see, platform shoes from the 70s as well. I would also like to bring in the Alexis Carrington style 80s shoulder pad dress. My bucket list is very long for things I would like to see at the archives. But, you know, those are just a few. If you have them in your closet, bring them to the archives.
That's perfect. No, and that's the thing, is that I've always been so surprised by what we have in our collection. Every time I go back into textile storage with Ryan or Diane, like I learn something new about our amazing collection here, but there's always room to grow, to continue to tell the story of Alabama through these different, you know, fabrics and mediums. And so I think the final question that I would like to ask you is, why, in your opinion, because we heard from Diane, so I'd love to hear from you as well, why are textiles so important for museum collections, and why are they so important for us in telling the history of people, especially people here in Alabama?
Well, Diane did such a fantastic job in the beginning to talk about what we can tell from them. But if I had to leave it with anything, I would say because they make the people and the time period real. When you see a set of clothing that's a tangible symbol of the person who wore it. So you get a better sense of who that person was, how they lived, and even what style of pants they like to wear. But it does make them more real and more human to us.
Yeah.
And so I think that because we can relate to someone who had this type of clothing, or it reminds us of someone in our own family that wore those bell bottoms. I'm pushing really hard for bell bottoms, guys. But it is something that's very real and tangible that we can make these associations with. So I think that they're a valuable tool when we're interpreting a time period or a person.
They really do. That is a great point to make, that they kind of make them more real. Those Converse sneakers that Diane was talking about, you see people walking around them today, but there's something about them that takes it from an ordinary object into an extraordinary story.
Exactly.
And that's whenever I walk through and see the textiles, both in Alabama Voices and in Justice Not Favor, I'm just always blown away by how they can really expand our understanding of the history of Alabama. So thank you so much to Ryan and to Diane for this amazing tour and this Q&A about the textiles and Justice Not Favor. And like I said, I really hope that you're able to come see them and the rest of the exhibit that's open until May 31st. Thank you all so much.